Hello, and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and broader strategic issues in focused detail so you can build a clearer and more accurate big picture. So I have with me, as always, Arslan Khan. Hi, Arslan, how are you?
Yeah, hey man, I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. So let's just dive into it. I'm going to actually hand this off to you. So the question is India procuring or planning to procure the Su-57 Felon?
Well, so firstly, let's do a little bit of a background on the Su-57 and India, because this dysfunctional love affair between the two has existed for about nearly 2 decades now, actually, because in early 2007, Russia and India decided to sign a joint agreement to develop a fifth generation fighter. So as I said, nearly 2 decades ago, design contracts were allocated in the 2010s and all that sort of stuff. And then as we went on, the sort of expected stuff happened, project delays and requirements not being met and disagreements between the partners. And I think the sort of roadblocks and the sort of nails in the coffin were really the disagreements and also the inability of the program to meet the expectations set out by the Indians. So if we look at what originally was cited by the Indians, the kind of low observability characteristics of the Su-57 weren't what they expected. And there was also some complaints about the avionics and also how Russia was unwilling to release some of the avionics. But also there was an issue where the maintenance and support and sustainment costs were unacceptable to the Indians. But also another really interesting thing, and we'll round back to this after, is the Indians wanted a twin-seat fighter because of the additional, what they felt would have been the additional workload, when it came to like man-on-man teaming and all the information presented to the crew on board. They felt that it would have been overwhelming for a pilot to operate operate the aircraft and also be able to understand and take in the information being provided by the variety of sensors on board. So the Indians really wanted a twin-seat aircraft, whereas the Russians really wanted a single seat. Now, this was something that was particularly this last point. This was something that was actually sort of worked out in the end. Was the Indians would, I believe, the twin seat would have been developed in India or with India or something like that. I'm going from memory here. And basically, the agreement was, Russia would procure X amount of twin seats, India would procure X amount of single seats. Actually, I think it was this twin seats would have been built in India and the singles had been built in Russia, and they both basically agreed to procure a set number of each one. So both partners were able to benefit from that in theory. There was some other there have been some things that have been corrected since the reports. So, for example, there was an Indian report citing like a lack of radar blockers and S ducting, and they quoted, the F-35 uses S ducts, and so does, they quoted the FA-18 Super Hornet makes use of radar blockers. But the Su-57 at its time, didn't have any treatments applied to its intakes because, they used the same old flanker style podded intakes, it exposed the fan blades of the engines, increasing its reflectivity. So, these were things that were corrected in subsequent production models and also prototypes. The Su-57, we know for a fact it makes use of radar blockers, for example. So, it's not like, I think but at the time of these disagreements and whatnot, the project was in its infancy. And, as it matured, things did improve. And actually, we also saw now, and this is what sort of triggered this all, is the Russians developed a twin-seater of the Su-57 with their own funding, without any Indian funding or any Indian nudges. The Indians didn't nudge them into this, and they weren't, the partnership was over, in effect. And that's quite interesting because if we look back at the original project, it was something the Russians really weren't very interested in. They really just were interested in a single-seater aircraft. It was the Indians that were pushing for the twin-seat. And it's really interesting because it shows on the Russian side that they're really, really looking to get India back on board onto the Su-57 program. And there's a multitude of reasons for this, right? Like scalability is a big thing. Production, the Russians aren't really able to buy these in huge numbers. And actually, the Russians scaled back their orders, I believe, during the FGFA times, to then increase the number of legacy fighters to offset the sort of costs of this procurement. So, the Russians really need a partner in this program for production scale, to bring down those costs, and to be able to exploit these economies of scale and really make it an affordable program. Because at the moment, the Russians don't exactly have huge numbers of the Su-57 in production, in service. I think they've got one export order with Algeria. It's not like huge numbers either. and they've got a massive development cost that they need to amortize over some, you know, production units. And for that reason, the Russians are really, really desperate for a partner, not only a surface level partner, but like a deep industrial partner, like the Indians have always been for the Russians. And now, if we, this is, I'll rope you into this as well, Bilal, at some point. But this is, if we look at the Su-57, I am personally of the belief that this would possibly be one of the best things to happen for Pakistan in terms of Indian procurement, is if the Su-57 was to be purchased. Firstly, we've discussed this in an episode prior, and I'll reference it again. It's the episode we did on the next big project for the Pakistan Air Force as a tactical data link. It's one of our earlier episodes, and you'll find it if you scroll down. But in that episode, I talked about how fifth generation fighter aircraft and advanced systems like fifth and like UCAVs and whatnot are really, really the systems on board are really, really well integrated into the airframe itself, but also with the other systems. So you can't, if we talk about like legacy radars, for example, like the F-16, if you look at the F-16, you could fit the scalable agile beam radar, or the Sabre. I think it's the APG-83 on the line, right? You don't need to like take the aircraft out of service. You don't need to. You can fit that. You can retrofit that on the line. So because the integration into the airframe isn't that deep, right? Nor is the integration with the other systems like to the level of something like a F-35 or a J-35 or even a Su-57 in this case. A lot of the systems are built into the airframe itself. If we look at some of the antennas, for example, they modern fifth generation aircraft, and even the next generation, the subsequent generation, will make use of CLBAs, like conformal load bearing antennas, for example. Those are antennas that are just baked into the airframe, right? You can't just go and swap them out. Other than that, you've got, as I said, these systems are deeply integrated with one another. The Russia and the Indians, from the start, had a requirement for different avionics. So the Russians, for example, used the N-036 radar on their Su-57s, and the Indians had a requirement, or it was basically a new radar that was developed specifically for the Indian aircraft. So if we go back to what I was saying, is I think it would probably be the best thing to happen to Pakistan is if the Indians were to go into this U-57 program and for example, demand that changes were to be made, or we change equipment for Indian equipment like radars or electronic warfare systems or whatever. We're talking, firstly, you need to go out and develop these systems. The Su-57, for example, if the Indians wanted to put a new radar on it, the Su-57 makes use of a ton of arrays. I believe it's got about 5 front-facing radar arrays, which is a pretty big number. Some in the L band, some in the X band. I can't remember. Yeah, so it's not something that can just be adapted from another design that they may have, and just adapt it into the Su-57. Not only that, but like these are, for example, these radars are very well integrated into your data links and into your electronic warfare systems, and it's all very, very well linked. That's the key here, is everything is very deeply integrated. So all of these modifications and changes add time, add cost, and complexity to a already very complex program. On top of that, we know that any changes to these systems would push the procurement back by decades even. And this isn't necessarily a procurement that would happen overnight already. So we're already talking timelines, in 2030s, 2040s, 2050s type thing. On top of that, the other really sort of beneficial thing for Pakistan would basically just kill AMCA, right? There would be no AMCA. It just would stop existing, because at some point there's going to have to be a conversation in the IF, because they have, their fingers are in too many pies, type thing. People will say they've got a huge budget and all these sort of things, but that budget is depleting pretty fast. When we talk about 114 Rafales, it's not a cheap buy by any standards. Then we've got money being poured into AMCA, then Tejas, then Mark II, and all these things. It's something's going to need to give. And if the Indians are procuring an in-class Su-57, I feel AMCA would probably be the first thing to give as well, because again, the AMCA in itself, from my perspective, and I'm not super well versed on it, so I'm sure somebody will correct me in the comments or shit on me in the comments, but AMCA in itself is a pretty ambitious I say, or even I would say, delusional timeline, right? 8 to 9 years from now for induction is just not happening. There's no chance. on top of that, there's this like with India, there's always and Pakistan as well. To be fair, there's always like weird bureaucratic red tape. Now the Indians have disqualified HAL from producing the AMCA, right? I believe of the production partners, I can't, this is all off the top of my head, but I think one or two had aerostructures experience. I think it was Tata who had some, Lockheed offloaded some production of the C-130J and F-16V parts to Tata. So, they're probably, from memory, they're the only ones with aerostructures experience. So there's also that, right? Like your production partners don't even have the experience needed to produce what you want them to produce. So it's like, there's a lot of uncertainty on that front. So having a Su-57 in India, possibly even being produced in the Su-30 production lines, because the Russians said that the lines are not significantly different. You could adapt the Su-30 MKL production line to make Su-57s, and everything would be okay. It would so it would basically be a death sentence for AMCA, in my opinion. The other key thing is the maintenance being an issue, where as I said before, the Russians, this was like not even like at the peak of Russian sanctions, right? So the Indians had already identified that the Su-57 would be quite difficult to maintain. It would be quite problematic on that front. And this was, as I said, when the Russians were in a relatively better position. Now, if we look at this, the Russians are in an infinitely worse position. They're heavily sanctioned, more than they've ever been before. Everybody's cracking down on the flow of parts and fancy equipment to Russia to ensure that they can't continue to support these industries. And on top of that, these fifth generation fighter aircraft are already heavily maintenance intensive. So we take a very maintenance intensive program that was already even more maintenance intensive than expected, and then reduce the flow of spare parts, make sanctions, put sanctions in place, make transfer of money and equipment even more difficult. You're in for a cocktail of maintenance issues again. On top of that, the other really really important stuff, in my opinion, and the more interesting bits is obviously the political backlash as well. And I think this is where, Bilal, you'd probably be able to touch on better than me. Is the political backlash would be huge. Europe is like at the peak of its anti-Russian sentiment, rightfully so, right? And I cannot imagine a world where it would not be up in arms against India if this was to happen. A Su-57 buy would basically be a massive cash injection into the Russian economy, into the Russian aerospace industry, and it would also be directly seen as blood on Indian hands. They are directly supporting the Russian war machine via a purchase of the Su-57. It would be a massive purchase. It would be a massive cash injection, which is exactly what the Russians need for these industries. Because ever since the Cold War, we've seen the Russian aerospace industry has been on its decline, right? Like, they've been struggling financially. MiG, for example, was basically defunct. Not defunct, but it's effectively ineffective. They're not making anything new. They're really relying off of sustainment and support contracts. So Quwa is doing quite well, but they need a partner. They need a partner, and they need a cash injection. And the Indians have always been that cash cow for the Russians. That when the Russians need a bailout, the Indians are the people to call. And in exchange for the bailout, they'll offload some technology and some work to the Indians, and the Indians will be happy as well. The Indians know how to play the Russians. But the key here is it would be perceived really, really horribly in the West. Europe would be up in arms against India. The US would be, the US probably, while maybe less upset than the Russians, but it's pretty clear that the US is also quite growing tired of India and others buying Russian oil, for example. So we may even see CATSA get enacted here. It would be devastating for the Indians politically, diplomatically, and also in supporting their current equipment as well, right? With heavy sanctions from the West, who knows whether they'd be able to carry on supporting this stuff, their Western origin platforms. The other thing is also obviously Russia and India. India gets locked into Russia again for the next couple of decades, and once again, obviously, that's driving a wedge in between India and the West because of Ukraine, and also it gives you the sort of double benefit that the Ukrainians are also not going to be particularly interested in Russia as well. In India as well. The other sort of last, maybe a little bit more like analytical type point I want to touch on is the Russian, and this is more like in reference to the J-35 and other competitive aircraft, is the Russian aerospace and electronics industry is like very questionable at best nowadays. Maybe not in terms of aerospace, but particularly avionics, right? The Russians are quite dependent on legacy systems, and the N036 is basically the first ever sort of production widely deployed Russian fighter ASA, full stop, right? The Russians have not been able to successfully mass produce an ASA radar for a fighter aircraft until the Su-57. They tried with the MiG-35, but I don't believe they managed to get much in way of export orders. I think they have a few in service in the Russian Air Force, but it's been very, very limited. So this is the first widely deployed Russian radar. And the problem is, and this is, I'm sure, something that the Indians will pick up on as well, because it's something that they've complained about before, is the legacy systems on board, is that even the N036 relies on legacy technology. Like, for example, it's a gallium arsenide-based radar, and there are obviously going to be downfalls and negatives associated with that. For example, gallium nitride radars, they allow a superior power density, sometimes even up to by like a factor of 10. So you can theoretically pump more power in, basically improving your performance, while even when limited by the physical size of the array. They're obviously also less thermally efficient, so basically less radiated power, more and more cooling needs, more heavy duty cooling needed. Gallium nitride radars also have longer duty cycles, so basically, how long it's radiating due to them being more efficient. You're also able to play with higher power like waveforms due to having a far larger power budget. You've got better beam sharpening ability, which obviously gives you greater detection range. So basically, in effect, like gallium nitride, the current generation of systems are basically better in every single way. And there's a lot more that we can go into in detail. Maybe we'll do an episode on radars later, but in effect, the Russians, the N036, which is the sort of crown jewel of the Su-57 and the crown jewel of the Russian avionics industry, is still heavily reliant on older gen tech, where most of the world is moving towards gallium nitride based radars and onwards as well. So yeah, basically, it's kind of like it's it would be very beneficial for Pakistan for this to happen. You'd lock India into a failing Russia once again for the next, 3, 4, 5 decades, maybe not 5 decades, but 2, 3, 4 decades. India is once again locked into what is a failing Russia. Russia is a shadow of what it was once upon a time, and it will continue to shrink as this war goes on and its economy gets crippled. I don't know if you've got anything to touch on with what I've said, Bilal. If not, we can get on to our next segment.
Yeah, that was comprehensive. If I just had to add a few things, I would say that, at least from the Indian perspective, I can see why this is happening. And I don't think it's solely because of the apparent threat of the PAAF potentially procuring J-35s. I don't think that's the sole driver. Because if you look at the way India's defense procurement stuff works, I've been trying to follow it for some time now. I've been beginning to notice two trends. The first is that the Indian Air Force has a generally hate relationship with the Indian defense industry. I feel that the two tend to be on opposing sides quite a bit. Now, this is a very gross misreading. They have a lot of alignment, right? And then the alignment tends to come, in my perspective, on the Russian aircraft. So what you find is that if you look through India's defense procurement history, you find that the Russians have traditionally been the most willing to offload technology, to build the Indian industry's capacity, and to help that industry leverage its capacity to the point where they can essentially produce pretty, I would say, seizable chunks of an aircraft domestically through indigenous inputs. Like I think with the Su-30, for example, I think about a significant chunk of the engine is basically manufactured within India using Indian inputs. Like it's not even assembled; like it properly manufactured there. In addition to parts of the Su-30 and what have you. So the Russians have been willing to basically invest, or rather transfer, actual capacity and technology. And of course, on the Indian side, you have to credit them that they've been investing in the upstream inputs to be able to absorb that technology or that know-how to be able to manufacture stuff. So basically, like if you were to put India on a spectrum, it's maybe like a lot closer, not maybe, it's actually definitely a lot closer to where China was or is, as opposed to where Pakistan is, right? That's there's no comparison there. However, I would say is that but with each year, they're getting close to where China is in many of the upstream inputs. However, they have some very, big structural problems, which pretty much every country now faces except for China, which is in the rare earths, critical technology side. However, that being said, the point is, and the main point is that the Russians, especially now, if you look at the way Putin is promoting the Su-57 to India, they are willing to basically literally contract work out to the Indian industry. And I feel that Moscow is also likely willing to negotiate or at least discuss real supply chain integration with India, because as you said, they themselves need that now, right? The war in Ukraine has been very taxing on them. the US-led and now European-led co-led sanctions have basically been, really stifling Russia's ability to leverage the international market for, the most advanced inputs. They are solely dependent on the Chinese, and that can raise some questions later as well, which we'll get into discussing towards the end of the podcast. But the point being is that Russia needs India, and I think they are willing to definitely basically genuinely co-produce the Su-57 because it might be too difficult for the Russian industry to handle on its own at this time, given the circumstances. And that is resonating with the Indian defense industry. And the Indian defense industry, whether it's the state-owned actors, the private sector actors, they know that they're going to get a bigger chunk of the revenue pie through a Russian deal than a French deal. Now, the nature of the French deal is that, the French, I think, you can recall the whole, the ongoing issue they're having, the friction point they're having over the source codes or, allowing India to integrate its own munitions to the Rafale. I think with the French, the issue is that no matter what they promise, the problem the French have, especially the French government, is that they have a very aggressive labor class. Like their labor parties or their labor, their labor politics is a very difficult thing to sort of win over. And if the French government at any given point loses the support of the labor groups, then they stand to lose the elections the next year. So Macron and these guys, they cannot go around. How much are you going to give India? Just put yourself in the seat of a Western politician, right? You're going to give India immigration, you're going to give India exports, right? You're going to allow Indian goods to come into the European market or the French market. You're going to do offshoring to India. Are you also going to now give them the Rafale as well on top of that? How much is the French labor class going to actually tolerate, right? Before they tell the French government to get lost, right? So I think Macron has to basically play a delicate game where on the one hand, he definitely wants the big ticket IAF order. I think the IAF, to its credit in this context, wants the Rafale order to go through, because from a technical standpoint, that is the best approach. If you just look at it from, we have a good platform, we've integrated the platform, we know how this platform works, and we are comfortable with it. We want more of these aircraft, right? For example, the PLAAF, yes, it was able to down at least one unit, it seems, right? However, the issue is that the PLAAF was able to afford about 20 J-10s, right? And it's evidently it's struggling to get more J-10s and J-17s due to Pakistan's structural economic problems. However, the IF is sensing, look, we don't mind losing Rafales, right? It's not the issue. We need to outnumber the PAF quickly, right? We need more of these platforms. We should have sent, multiple squadrons, like 3 or 4 squadrons of these on on the evening of May 6th, 7th. So the point being is that the IF wants the Rafale deal, the Indian defense industry, and then, maybe the wider interest groups within India want the Felon, and you're going to have them basically come up with, I think, a messy compromise, which basically dovetails into all the stuff that you've discussed and all the downstream effects that's going to have. And I think for Pakistan, it's definitely an opportunity that I think, this is the moment where you start to basically you should be developing a spine in your foreign policy. And this is the moment where you should be going to Beijing and Moscow and be like, hey, no, we don't like this deal, and we're not going to accept it. And now they're going to, the Indian side might be sitting there saying, what are you going to do about it? We have all the money. Well, the problem is, at the end of the day, we can tell the Chinese that, look, do you want your rare earths to go and arm an adversary? How does that make any rational sense? It's one thing to say that, okay, an India-Pakistan tension situation doesn't concern us. It's their problem. We're going to just, trade with both sides. Fair enough. But that's not the reality. If you're Pakistan, you should really be telling the Chinese, hey, the US is trying to, integrate India into the Quad and use them to corner and contain you. It makes zero sense at any level that your rare earths and your industries should be contributing to any Indian project, whether it's through Europe, whether it's through Russia. It should not happen. You would have to be deluded and an idiot to allow this to happen. And, and that is the message you have to lay on to them and say that, look, if you can't take your own security seriously, we're not going to take your security seriously. That's how it's going to have to roll. If you yourselves don't take your security seriously and you're going to go and arm India, it's going to harm both us and you. Well, we don't care about you. We cannot guarantee anything at that point because you yourself are sabotaging your own positioning. And I think the Chinese will at least understand that much. And obviously, if you follow the way that Chinese Americans have been engaging in terms of their issues, the Chinese have started to implement tighter controls and enforce them on their rare earths, at least on the American side of the equation. And I think the problem the Chinese have with the Russians is that they need Russian energy, right? And that is where I think this stuff the Chinese stuff might ultimately leak through to India. So, this is where it gets into the world of international relations and foreign policy, and this is going to require a very different way of thinking on the Pakistani side. However, you cannot just confine it on the pure technical merits. Like, I would rather, if I could leverage some foreign policy win to take India's modernization program and slow it down by 10, 15 years, I would love to do that, right? Because that might be a lower cost, lower risk move than having to expedite in a rush a J-35 purchase, for example, because India is going to get like their first squadron of SU-57s. Like, that's the way I sort of see it. So I think we can go into the feedback from the last episode, which is going to take up a pretty big chunk of this episode. I would say it's a bit of a continuation of that discussion. So we've been following all of the comments, and you know what? Like, I think let's just get into it, because we I sort of hinted towards it in my previous point. So let's unpack the Russia versus Ukraine argument from Pakistan's perspective. So the way I approach it is like, let's use some first principles thinking, right? By first principles, I mean, what is the reference point? What is the point that we're going to reference as a barometer for whether something should be correct or incorrect? This is how we should start. So if your reference point is to form good, let me put it this way: here's a question to our audience. Is the reference point here to form good ties with Russia, or is it to pursue Pakistan's interests? Because if the reference point for all your thinking is to prioritize Russia, and your approach to everything is to try and fit everything within that paradigm of, I want good relations with Russia, so I'm not going to fit everything downstream in order to achieve good relations with Russia, then this conversation stops right now, right?
Yeah.
Because that is a dogmatic view, and a dogmatic view can never be measured and assessed on any objective terms, because you already decided what you want to do, right? And then you're just basically hammering and shoehorning everything into that, and that's and it's not just, I would say, I'm not going to say it's a pro-Russian group who are guilty of this. Like, they're not the only ones. We have this crew we have these sorts of people from all walks of life. We have pro-Russian, pro-American, pro-Chinese, pro-Saudi, pro-Irani. So we have all of that, right? We have, look at the political scene domestically. Everyone starts at, I want to do this thing, and I'm going to force everything else to fit within that thing, as opposed to sort of asking the more basic or more foundational question, is this good for Pakistan? And then we unpack it from there. So from that standpoint, if I take this conversation from the starting point of, is this good for Pakistan? Then from that point, we can at least definitely have to acknowledge that, yes, the J-17, which is our mainstay fighter aircraft, does use the Russian Klimov RD-93 engine. However, now we have to get into more of the nuances of that. Number one, we don't actually procure the RD-93 bilaterally from Russia. We actually get it through China. So China, to its credit, in this context, asserts its weight and influence to make sure those engines get to Pakistan. However, while those engines do get to the J-17, they come with strings attached, because now they're coming through China. And I think, Arslan, you can speak to this more, but I just wanted to sort of fast track it, is that because of these strings, Pakistan had to, on its own merits, on its own terms, go to Ukraine to help break those strings, because those strings would have bankrupted us.
Yeah,
right?
So Pakistan had tried numerous times to rope in Russia directly, but there was always issues on that front. Firstly, the way the contracts were set up was that everything had to go via China, in effect. Obviously, it's a gross simplification, but, in effect, we were basically made entirely reliant on China on that front, to the point where we weren't even given like OEM part numbers and whatnot. It was kind of to the point where the Chinese would take whatever the catalogs were, take the part numbers, convert them into like a Chinese part number, give us the Chinese part number. So then when we sent them over to the Russians, and we had tried to directly get in touch with the Russians, we'd send them to the Russians, and the Russians would have no clue what we're talking about. So we'd have to go back to the Chinese, give them their markup, and then buy via them. But on top of that, there was also very little Russian support for Pakistan when it came to the RD-93. As I said before, the MRO facility in Pakistan is not recognized by Russia. It's not supported by Russia. If for example, a MiG-29 customer, is having some engine issues and they need an overhaul, or they needed some support or something, Klimov would not be able to say, okay, look, there's a facility in Pakistan, fly a jet over to there, or take a jet over to there, and they'll sort it out. Because in their eyes, it doesn't exist. So they also don't support us, because we're not technically authorized to conduct this sort of intensive maintenance and support on the RD-93 platform. On the other hand, Ukraine has been very, very helpful. We have been able to purchase a ton of spare parts from Ukraine directly. We've also received a ton of support from Ukraine directly on the program, which has allowed us to bypass some of the Chinese arm twisting and extortion, while also having allowing us to bypass the Russian nonsense that we have to deal with.
Exactly. And now that's on the RD-93 issue. And then also we know that with probable future blocks, the J17/PFX Alpha and whatever, that basically we're going to essentially be adopting a Chinese engine. And there's a whole different conversation we have to get into later. But that being said, that's on the Russia and us depending on Russia for the RD-93. Right now, we really rely a lot on Ukraine and obviously even the wider commercial market. So there are probably other MiG-29 users who are, like Azerbaijan or what have you, might be helping us out in some respects as well, potentially, on supporting our JF-17s for now. Now, the second question or the second issue is, okay, now down to China. So China is going and has developed, their own series of engines. They have integrated them onto the JF-17. They've begun testing for it. Why are we being critical of China now? Didn't they do all this for us? Well, here's the thing, right? At the end of the day, China does not do any of this and did not do any of this out of the goodness of its heart, right? China, okay, if I had to give China credit, and this is why I will 100% give China credit, it is whatever they sign on contract, they will honor the contract as long as you enforce the contract on your end, right? So meaning that unlike the Americans, when Pakistan signed on to the Peacegate 3 and 4 F-16s, and suddenly, for the other wider political issues suddenly come back to the table and they start pressuring our nuclear program, then they revoke the F-16s. Like that doesn't happen with China, right? The Chinese are very straightforward and they are, in that sense, very good from a commercial standpoint, which is why the whole world relied on them for manufacturing, right? They're, you get what you pay for, literally. And you have to be a very good enforcer of the contract on your end. That's fair enough. However, at the end of the day, none of this is happening out of the goodwill of China. So China is not going out of its way to go and help Pakistan achieve, something through the JF-17. Everything from the JF-17, from the code development stuff, from the work that's happening within China to further develop it, subsystem integration, all that is being paid by Pakistan. It's being paid by the taxpayers of Pakistan. Pakistan pays money, right? Just the way India pays Russia money. Yes, in return for that money, we do get quite a bit, right? Compared to some of the Western suppliers. That's true. But at the end of the day, we do pay China, right? And not only that, even though PAC does co-manufacture the J17, again, people, we have to get into the nuances, right? We have to get into deeper level of thinking. You have to ask, where do the alloys come from? Where do some of the subsystems come from? Where do the electronics that go into the avionics? I know people say, well, PAC manufactures the avionics. Okay, but we don't have this massive semiconductor industry sitting around somewhere in Pakistan, right? So all those inputs are coming from somewhere. They're coming from either the West, they're coming from Far East Asia, like South Korea, Japan, Singapore, or something, or they're coming from China, right? Or Europe. So the point being is that the upstream inputs are still being imported by Pakistan. And then we are able to put them together. So, I mean, it's not assembly. It's not like we're getting pre-made kits. No, we're doing original design and integration work. But the thing is that we are at the end of the chain, like towards the end of the chain. Like we're in the last third of the chain, basically, right? We're in the part where you integrate the stuff that's available, you test it, you validate it, then you assemble it, right? There's the whole industry before that where the majority of the money gets made. So even though PAC co-manufactures the JF-17, I assure you that again, even from that work, a chunk of that money still goes back to China, but through different industries. It doesn't go to AVIC, right, which is their prime aircraft, design and production OEM, but it goes through the higher level upstream inputs like the steel industry, the alloys industry, the composites industry, because we don't have those industries, right? Or rather, our industries are not as well scaled and as big as theirs. So the point being is that the Chinese through the J17 are also emerging as net winners. Like think about it. Just think about it. The tooling comes from China. The upstream inputs come from China. The R&D and development work that's been continued on the J17, like the engine test, is done in China. So what do you mean China is helping us out? This is a good commercial business for them. Yes, It's not the biggest commercial business, fair enough. But the one thing I know about the Chinese, and you can speak to any foreign policymaker who has to go into trade negotiations with the Chinese, no project is too small for the Chinese. They will, if they could produce everything in the world, they will literally do it. Like you can speak to anyone. You can speak to the Indian trade delegations. You can speak to the Canadian trade delegations. You can speak to the Pakistani trade delegations. You can speak to the American trade. You can speak to any trade delegation, anyone. If the Chinese would prefer to manufacture everything, right? That is how they think, right? And we don't understand why they have this obsession with foreign currency surpluses and maintaining everybody's having a basically being they're building the bank infrastructure and the pool, like they're building the bank for becoming a reserve currency, but they're not really taking on the responsibility of being a reserve currency. Because if you notice the way the Americans operate is that yes, the Americans, many countries would import fighter aircraft and consumer goods and whatever from America. But then American companies would go back and invest in those other countries and then also buy things from them. That's called economic integration. What China wants to do is just wants to sell, 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 right? And that's basically the issue here. So yes, no project is too small for the Chinese industry. Like they might say it, but the actions speak way louder than words. All you do is track the action. So that's another issue here.
Yeah.
And then,
but also with the Chinese, right? With the Chinese, right, it's not like it's a spectrum, isn't it? Like, well, some industries, some companies may be producing the cutting, and particularly when it comes to JF-17, and we've seen this with the J-10. I believe, if my understanding is correct, Chengdu has offloaded its production line to GAIC or something. The point is it's a very well integrated under AVIC. It's all very well integrated. Where the sort of prime producers, when they're needed for something more important, the Chinese don't dump it. They don't get rid of it like the West does. They carry on producing, or they carry on, keep the tooling, and they carry on producing these maybe not top of the line systems still for export, but by lower tier players. Hell, the Chinese were still producing F7s in 2013, 2014, brand new ones. And on top of that, also, I believe you mentioned that the Chinese have been pretty well stuck to their commitments. And I would question that, and particularly in reference to the JF-17, because I think you may be able to touch better on this. But was there not a commitment from the Chinese for a domestic buy of the JF-17 as well?
Yeah. So I mean, look, I was just trying to be a bit more fair and give something to the Chinese side. But yes, that is a black spot under history, right? When Pakistan signed on to the MOU with China in the late 90s to co-produce the JF-17, to co-develop it. Like, remember, Pakistan was footing. So you put it this way: look, Pakistan was going to pay a portion of the development cost, and a bulk of that development work and R&D work was going to happen in China. Now, if you think about this rationally, just think about what this means. Just think about it. Just stick with me. What this means is that Pakistan is going to pay money that'll go to Chinese engineers and Chinese labs for them to improve their R&D. So the whole DSI intake that came through the JF-17, it was in big part, thanks to Pakistani funding. Does Pakistan know anything about developing DSI intakes? No, we don't, because we never got that R&D knowledge back, right?
Yeah.
That's the contract we signed into. Fair enough. But here's the thing. The contract also was supposed to involve the People's Liberation Army Air Force buying 200 JF-17s.
Yeah.
They're supposed to buy. So imagine, there was supposed to be 2x the number of JF-17s right now, which was supposed to help distribute this R&D cost. Now, the thing is, even though the R&D cost wasn't a whole lot in the big scheme of things, imagine how much of a benefit it would have had if we had another 200 Chinese fighters, like Chinese Air Force fighters. It would have made the cost of each individual JF-17 even lower. So low that it would have been lower than, definitively lower than some like an L-15 or a J-10, right? Which we don't even know. Like, we actually don't know if the JF-17 is even lower in cost compared to these, like, from an upfront standpoint, compared to these other platforms, because they have more production compared to JF-17, right? So this is the issue: is that the Chinese, you could argue, again, I don't know their intention, but here's what happened. Here are the actions. The actions are that they had multiple lightweight fighter programs. They had JF-17, L-15, J-10. Two of those, they inducted and manufactured and produced at scale for their own domestic purposes. The one that had a partnership with Pakistan, they didn't opt for that. So then the R&D overhead was distributed pretty evenly and pretty well across the other two, right? So helping them drive the costs of those aircraft down, whereas ours was solely borne by the PAF.
Yeah.
So what is this?
With some basic napkin math, you'd probably expect a cost reduction of about 10% per unit if we had doubled the order size. But on top of that, what's more important than that is the sustainment aspect. And now, I think if we think back to the time of the F-16 XL, and this is at the time the UAE was willing to fund the project. However, the key requirement was that the US Air Force would need to have bought into the project as well. If not, they wouldn't fund it. And this is one of the biggest things. And this is also why I'm not a huge fan of buying into projects with little user base, because global support is a big thing. And I'll touch on that in a second. But if the Chinese were also to buy the JF-17, there would have been 10 times more companies competing for parts tenders and sustainment contracts. There would have been 10 times more, obviously I don't literally mean 10 times, but the point I'm trying to make is there would be a far greater spares pool. There would be a far greater vendors pool. Everything, it would have been a far better supported project, and it would have been a far cheaper project as well. So by the Chinese pulling out from this project, it could have been quite dangerous to us all. We could have actually seen the collapse of the J-17 at that point. But I think at that point in time, it was too important to fail for the Pakistan Air Force because they had no other options. However, as I said, it's always been a key requirement, for Pakistan and and other air forces as well. Whenever they're buying into a project with little global use, that the sort of developing country has to have some involvement in it, some investment in it, because if not, what's stopping them from just pulling the rug, screwing you over? Nothing. So the lack of widespread induction of the J-17 into the PLAAF was risky and also dangerous for the Pakistan Air Force, but also has led to an increase in cost. There was not too long ago, the Pakistan Air Force was struggling to buy certain connectors for the avionics systems on board. It's little things like that that just wouldn't have happened if there was widespread PLA use, because they would, more vendors would have had more interest in actually keeping the fleet supported, because there would have been a greater demand. Right now, the Pakistan Air Force can only buy so much spares and support for the JF-17. But if the Chinese were involved as well, we would have seen far greater support in that front as well.
Absolutely. And I know the comeback to that will be, well, people say, well, what other option did the PAF have? The Chinese were the only ones who were willing to do this. At the end of the day, we did basically co-produce an aircraft in Pakistan, but that's okay. So let's walk that backwards. The co-production in Pakistan, again, like PAC has a bunch of tooling. It can bring together a JF-17, but the upstream imports come from outside. So we did not build an actual aerospace industry. Now we're trying to do that through NASTAP, right? We're trying to do that through also recently, like the Ministry of Defense Production is basically kind of brought in the private sector and gave them the reins on Pakistan's drone front. And if you notice, because of that very smart move, the drone industry in Pakistan is booming, right? Like you have many private sector companies now emerging, producing all sorts of, capable solutions, and you're seeing some of the upstream indigenization happen, right? That's what we're talking about. But that was done under a different framework compared to the JF-17. The JF-17 is that, okay, we didn't get the aerospace industry. Then, okay, we got a good, multi-role lightweight fighter aircraft. However, now we're dealing with the downstream challenges of that, right? We are dealing with, for example, having to probably make a pivot in terms of the engines, right? We're dealing with, for example, having to work with Ukraine, who wasn't even an original partner with the JF-17 on maintaining our own fighter plane, right? We are dealing with, we had dealt with, for example, when we were in the Block 1 days, when we were importing the avionics from China, and I think, Arslan, you were able to spot the cost differences, but basically like the MFDs, the HUD, and all these things were being basically imported wholesale from China, and they were like at 2x, 3x markups, and
it's ridiculous.
Pakistani companies had to step in and basically design, and I mean, at the end of the day, they're sourcing the same things from China. They're going directly to the upstream suppliers. So it's like, in order to save that money, basically. So that's another example. The example of the range extension kit. So basically, this one's hilariously bad. So in the Block 1 days, the PAF had to import all the munitions for the JF-17 from China directly. And one was the range extension kit, the precision guided glide bomb, basically the Chinese equivalent to the joint direct attack munition, or the JDAM. Well, if you read the Ministry of Defense Production report, so this is official data. We're not even making anything up. We're not saying trust us. Just go to the MODP website and just open up one of the earlier reports. And basically the listing of that was that we were paying about, what was it? Inflation adjusted.
It's $135 million, inflation adjusted, for 100 units of range extension kits. That's just the kit, not the bombs. These are not powered. They're no seekers. This is just the wing kit, GPS guided. That's $1.35 million per kit.
That is like what, 3 to 4x the JDAM cost?
An equivalent JDAM cost now, and I'm talking the range extended JDAM, that's a 5x multiplier over the cost of a single range extended JDAM. It's an insane example, and it's a very clear example of the kind of shakedowns we were seeing. Another example is the MFDs we're talking about. We were paying we were paying about 100 per MFD to the Chinese, and locally we were producing them for $60,000, which is still an insane number.
Because the
But
upstreams are still coming from China.
yeah, but that just tells you, they were able to knock half off of there. It's not like this difference would have been because of lower costs of labor. You're not paying $60,000 for that. Like, it's just an insane example. But the most egregious example that's publicly available and that you can all verify, because a lot of the stuff we're talking about now is stuff we know from what we've heard. But what you can go and physically verify is if you open up the MODP reports, you can see that Pakistan paid $100 million in 2014 for 100 range extension kits, which is, and bear in mind, that's without any transfer of technology, without any
We
local
asked.
production. Yeah, we confirmed this. This was purely just bought off the shelf for use on JF-17s and adjusted for current numbers. That's $135 million. It's egregious. It should be illegal.
The shakedown was so egregious that the PAF literally went to air weapons complex, which they don't do often, by the way. Like, they're not best buds. Like, they have like a IAF DRDO relationship, basically, the PAF and NESCOM. The PAF went to NESCOM and said, you need to build this locally. And that's where the Azub series came into the picture. And not only that, but NESCOM, Air Weapons Complex, or Al-Qaswa Industries, whatever they call themselves these days. But basically, they developed a whole family around the Azub, right? So they built the indigenous range extension kit, which was basically like, I guess, like, the 1-to-1. But then they built the powered versions, like the rocket powered version, the turbojet powered version. And now they're basically building their own like lineage and family of, precision guided munitions like the Rasub and the Azub 81LR. So the point being is that this whole family started because the PF was so, like, I think like one of the air headquarters staff or air headquarters was so angered by this that they had to bring in NESCOM, which is like
Rightfully so.
Yeah, and like PF does not bring in NESCOM very often. Like they will work with Bekar Group over NESCOM, it seems, but they brought in NESCOM. So that's like the nuclear option, basically, in a sense, right? So you can imagine how much of a shakedown that was. So now, and this is not just on, the arms procurement side. So we've established that, look, China made some benefit out of the JF-17. They didn't do this out of their goodness of their hearts, right? They continue to benefit from the JF-17 as a net gainer. Again, it's not from the goodness of their hearts. Then through the JF-17, they basically tried to extract big gains from Pakistan, right? Again, forcing us to basically innovate locally, essentially, to break from that. And, I would guarantee you that knowing NESCOM, I wonder who they collaborated with to design and develop the Azub series, right? Again, like it's probably wasn't China or not solely China. They probably went to other partners. And that's where, again, there's a possibility that, hey, did Ukraine help us out maybe in some areas? Did South Africa help us out in some areas, right? Did Poland or Brazil, like whoever. This is where this is where the stuff, or Turkey, like this is where the stuff comes from, right? And this is what we keep talking about. Go work with middle powers. They're going to, like our entire cruise missile line, right? Especially the air-launched cruise missile, like the Babur and, the Raad and the Timur, they're derived from South Africa's MUPSO technology. That came from South Africa, right? So this is why we keep saying, like, think about the middle powers, right? And now, I know this is a bit of a detour here because, we don't typically talk about the economic side, but again, one of the problems with Pakistani defense procurements is that we always run into the question, well, we don't have enough money. If we had enough money, we would have bought this, but we couldn't buy this because we didn't have enough money. And at some point you have to ask, why don't we have enough money? Like at some point we have to get into this conversation. Like there's almost so, like, if I was a Pakistani leader, if I was President Quwa sitting out here, and a general and I said, hey, why can't we buy stealth fighters? Why can't we buy this kind of submarine? And I keep hearing the word, we don't have enough money. I would imagine that I need to figure out, okay, what's going on here? So, let's look at the economy, right? Let's look at where our fiscal exchequer is going. Where's our fiscal budget going? Well, a big chunk of that, I think, like close to 50%, over 50% goes in debt servicing. Okay, where did that debt come from? Let's start with that. And then that's where you get into now we're going to try to dump the blame on the political civilian side of the equation. We've been pretty harsh on the military side, but it's the whole group, right? It's not just one group. It's not just one faction or one portion. So let's look at the popular one, CPEC. I know, Arslan, this has been your favorite on the forum, but let's look at one example of CPEC. So I mean, and I'm going to be like basically sort of breaking this down at a very simple level. It's not the most, even for my standards, not the most like in-depth economic analysis here, but it should just get the basic points across, right? So, one of the components of CPEC involved these weird little investments in energy infrastructure. And on the Pakistani side, this was pretty much, justified on the basis of, hey, we can't have industry if we don't have energy, or if we don't have affordable energy, which is a fair criticism. I can understand where that's coming from. However, when they brought in these Chinese investors, and to be fair, the Chinese were not the first ones to do this. They were like, I think American or I think American or European companies that did this in the 90s. But nonetheless, the Chinese came in and said, "Hey, we'll be happy to invest in your energy infrastructure. We'll set up we'll build everything from scratch. We'll make it like our top standards, blah blah blah." But the thing is, you have to agree to sovereign guarantees. So what a sovereign guarantees means is basically that the Pakistani government has to ensure that these independent power plants, or IPPs, will make a certain amount of money every year, meaning that they're going to guarantee that the Pakistani market is going to pay into this energy infrastructure. And, when this was happening, when the CPEC was signed and the infrastructure was being built, there was another thing happening in China. I don't know if you heard the solar revolution, the green energy revolution. So many Pakistanis, increasingly, the more higher income, middle income Pakistanis decided to go off the grid. So the ones who were the most able to pay for this, for this energy that China was building through the IPPs decided to go and import solar panels, right? And basically set up this whole parallel grid, essentially this distributed grid. Now, obviously, the market for the IPPs crashed, right? There's no one to buy them as much, and obviously, Pakistan's own regulatory problems prevented the growth of industry, and that's a whole other conversation we have to get into. But nonetheless, we won't have the time for that. But we'll, maybe down the line when we're lamenting about why Pakistan doesn't do a lot of good manufacturing, we'll get into it. But nonetheless, now the Pakistani government, aka really the Pakistani taxpayer, the few that are left, they are stuck with this bill, right? That has to basically go to China every single year, plus other countries. So, rough estimates, because the thing is, these figures aren't officially released by Pakistan, because again, I think it would just cause a bit of an uproar and really annoy everybody in the world when they see it as to why you would let your country undergo this kind of, torture. But basically, the estimates are that China gets from Pakistan around $1.5 to $2 billion a year through these IPPs. So when you talk about China giving us discounts and weapons and this and that, just keep remembering that from now into perpetuity, the Chinese would technically get 1.5 to 2 billion, or even more if CPEC was allowed to finish, $1 billion per year from Pakistan. So now you multiply that over a factor of 10, 15, 30, 60 years, you're basically going to end up, if CPEC was worth $60 billion in investment, the outflows from Pakistan to China would easily 1.5x to 2x that. And that's where our money's going. That's where some of our money is going. So now you have to wonder, okay, and I know where this is coming from. Like, I know the Pakistani officials who probably did this, like these guys, they want to show off that they got investment, right? And the Chinese came to them, showed them a number, said just sign on the dotted line. And Pakistanis, our leaders signed on the dotted line. They didn't have these sorts of conversations. They don't ask these sorts of questions. They didn't go back to the Chinese and say, what the hell is this? And I assure you, back in the day, in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, Pakistani officials used to go back to China and be like, what the hell is this? We used to put them in very uncomfortable situations to answer for why they are, charging us this, or why they're not releasing that, or so on and so forth. And I'll bring in guests who will speak to that as well, hopefully. But the point being is that the Chinese know this. Like, the Chinese are used to these conversations, except that Pakistanis never deliver them. Like, Indians will do a better job with basically negotiating with the Chinese on these things than Pakistan. That's the problem here.
Yeah. And I mean, I'd use the word investment particularly loosely here when it comes to CPEC. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the discounts and whatnot from weapons, it just gets made up in other places, right? Like, for example, we just talked about the range extension kits. The Chinese, I believe, and this is obviously, this is unverified. This is what we've heard as like general rumors, is, the Chinese sort of heavily subsidized the Type 54A frigates. But it's like, yeah, sure, they heavily subsidized that. But then, on the other hand, they ripped our skin off on maybe another contract. So it's kind of like, it's all very, it's 1 minute one way, the other minute the other way. So I wouldn't really, I personally don't really focus particularly heavily on stuff like that. You could make the same argument for the US. The US taxpayers have been paying for F-16s for God knows how long. So it's like, I don't really buy these arguments of, subsidized and discounted and all this sort of stuff. They don't do it out of the goodness of their heart. They do it to advance their foreign policy objectives.
Exactly. And to be clear, look, there was a time in the 50s, 60s, 70s, up till like the 80s, where, the Chinese did step in to help us out when we needed them, right? But that was a different China. Like, you have to remember when the Chinese leadership became market oriented. So before, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, their leadership was like, very dogmatic. They were, for the people, by the people. They had a very overt communist leaning, right? And that's what they used to try to advance in the region. And they had essentially, their interests aligned with Pakistan very directly, because the Chinese had this very overt, adversarial relationship with India. They saw India as like a colonial backyard, right? I mean, realistically, you could argue that Pakistan might not have been much different, obviously, but at the end of the day, Pakistan was willing to, Pakistan was fighting India. Chinese said, hey, like at that time, the Chinese Communist Party was like, hey, like these guys are pretty, they fight India quite a bit. It'd be good to have them on our side. And that's when we used to get assistance and development funding from China. That's 100% true. That's where, at that time, our scientists were working with Chinese scientists on our nuclear technology. There was a lot of certain joint projects. If you read Mansoor Ahmed's book, Pathway to the Bomb, we had a joint project with the Chinese on like water, like, light water, like heavy, I think light water, heavy water, basically basically reactor technology in the 80s. So basically that goodwill existed. But when the Chinese became this market-oriented leadership, when they decide to, sort of align themselves with the way the American, with American investors and what have you, a lot of that changed. Now it was like the bottom. They started focusing on the bottom line, right? And that's where and Pakistan was no exception to that, right? The way they dealt with Pakistan was, again, according to the bottom line. Like, if you speak to people who are genuinely close to these projects and had to implement them, they'll tell you this. And at some point, the facts are so obvious and apparent. Like, if you were to, if let's say, everything happened as it did, but the Chinese for some reason maintained this quote unquote special relationship with Pakistan, where they continued implementing the old Cold War era approach of development funding and what have you, then CPEC would not have been this investment loan mechanism thing. It would have literally been a cash transfer. I'm not even joking. Like, that's what Pakistan was actually receiving from China up until the 80s, right? And I don't want to go out and say, well, like, give us some cash, we deserve it. Actually, in a way, I am sort of saying that, because the point being is that at the end of the day, if Pakistan is there to basically provide and guarantee someone else's security, the security has a cost, right? Your interests have a cost, right? Your interests should not cost us money in order for us to, like, your interest should not be treated as like financial interest, where it starts compounding. So, on the one hand, we distract India, and on the other hand, you extract loans from us. No. It's supposed to be a transaction. And that aspect of our foreign policy and our ability to extract those gains has sort of fallen off a cliff in the last 20 years, is basically the issue here. And the effects, we're seeing it with China, we're seeing it with the way we deal with America, we're seeing it the way we deal with the Gulf. Like, we're really not exacting the premium that we deserve, right? And this is where you end up with a CPEC. This is where you end up with, literally trying to provide global peace and stabilize the Strait of Hormuz, right? And somehow get nothing out of it. Like, this is where this stuff is coming from, because not enough people at the top are going out and literally thinking in terms of, we're doing all this for you. Why should we, right? Like, why should we? And that's a question that Pakistanis have to ask of their leaders, right? Why is it you're always in this compromised position with regards to other countries? And we don't mean individuals, we mean as a group, as a collective. Like, why are we constantly repositioning Pakistan as this like basket case, right? Like, at the end of the day, every country wants some net gain, right? If Indians are going to laugh about us saying, hey, give us cash transfers, Indian negotiators are going to every single Western country asking for immigration spots for their, labor pool. Indians are saying, basically, India goes to Canada, US, whatever, and literally is saying, without overtly saying, is that, hey, our economy cannot sustain our entire population. We need other people to help us out. What is that? Is that not asking? Is that not a transaction? It is, right? So, I mean, at the end of the day, everybody just, come back down to earth here, and like, let's level set. Every country's ask and give. And the problem with Pakistan is that it's been giving. And what it gets in return is like not up to the level of what it's been giving.
Yeah, absolutely. We've said this before multiple times. Pakistan sells itself short. It's like it's like with It's funny. It's like we're giving charity to people. We'll happily go out and provide security and provide alternative trade routes and whatever, but we'll expect nothing or very little in return. We'll sell it out for basically nothing. If I was there in the states right now, I would have been, if I was I'd been lobbying the states so hard for investment and defense cooperation, and the same goes for China or whoever. There needs to be some benefit to these relationships. The Pakistan is bending itself backwards for the US. It needs to extract something. And this is the key here is when we say, when we criticize China and when we criticize Russia and the US, even. I know it's crazy, right? We criticize the US, but when we criticize all these places, it's not because we're interested in their adversary or whatever, but because we're interested in what's best for Pakistan, not what's best for the US, not what's best for Russia, not what's best for China. Now, when making those arguments, we do need to sort of angle it and give so for example, for pitching why Pakistan needs to collaborate with the US, we need to also pitch the alternative angle for those US policymakers, those US lawmakers, those US industry and analysts and whatever who are listening as well, that there is also a tangible benefit in this for you as well. Pakistan has rare earth minerals, the same thing you need as well. But then you've also got stuff Pakistan needs. You've got the political clout, you've got the economy and the economic might, and you've got the defense systems and all this sort of stuff. It's all part of the game. We have to pitch both angles. So it's not a case of, okay, screw China, whatever. China is the world's manufacturing hub. At some point, Pakistan is going to need to bite the bullet with China and really, it is going to need to figure out a mechanism to ensure everything stays fair. Because the reality is we do get taken for a ride by China regularly. It's not new. We hear about it all the time. And at some point, Pakistan's going to need to ask China, look, we need to reset our relationship. We need to make sure that we're being dealt with fairly and you're being dealt with fairly. And we're happy to, continue to collaborate with you because I do think Pakistan should collaborate with China, but also within reason in a way that's actually beneficial for Pakistan. Because at the moment, I've seen very little upside. For example, a lot of the stuff at CPEC, it's ridiculous. There was Gwadar Airport can handle an A380. Who the flying, you can figure out the rest, is going to fly an A380 into Gwadar Airport? But that's something we had to bear a portion of the cost for. And, this stuff is not cheap. The certifying taxiways, runways, gates, stands for A380s is not cheap. And, it's just an example of the kind of rampant corruption we saw as part of CPEC. So it's like there needs to be a reset here. We need to there needs to be a mechanism, there needs to be transparency. And a significant part of that is our fault, for a lack of accountability, for a lack of transparency. But it's also a significant issue on their part as well. A lot of the CPEC deals were transferred, funds transferred from the State Bank of China to Chinese companies direct. None of the money ever touched Pakistani hands. It would just be transferred to them direct, where they, and via very shady bidding processes, most likely to Xi's pals and whatnot, very shady bidding processes. And then the next day, you'd see a bunch of Chinese contractors knocking on Pakistan's door saying, look, we're here to build your new road. Pakistan really didn't touch any of the money. Pakistan didn't get much in terms of jobs or in terms of local investment and development, but Pakistan got a interest bill at the end of the month.
Exactly. And you know what? I know, again, here's what I would tell people. If you really want to verify what we're saying, instead of listening to the echo chambers of people who live in academia, media, and that includes us, instead of listening to people who don't actually produce tangible physical goods within Pakistan and export them, right? Don't listen to us. Go and listen to the people who do. Go find people who are involved in the steel industry. Go find people who are involved in the cement industry. Just go out to the pharmaceutical industry or the medical equipment industry. Go out and speak to these people and ask them, who do you export to? They'll say primarily Europe, US, Latin America, Poland, Ukraine, basically. Do you export to China? They're like, no. In fact, the Chinese are trying to get into our market. The Chinese are trying to get into Pakistan and put us out of business. And then you ask them, well, why is that a bad thing? Maybe you guys should be more efficient. What they'll come back and say is that we are the ones who bear, besides the salary class, besides your white collar workers, we're the other group that bears the tax burden. So we're the ones bankrolling this country along with like people in like the cities. We are the ones who bring in foreign currency gains, however little that is. So we help keep our currency stabilized, relatively speaking. It doesn't go down the complete drain thanks to our exports. We rely on those Western markets, right? We'd love for those Western markets to grow. Like, I remember this one guy in the construction materials industry. He was complaining that like Pakistan's policymakers are doing such a bad job at this, at driving trade and exports from Pakistan, is that if you go to Canada and the US, you're going to find these like weird low grade, like, I don't know, like cement mud or whatever. And it's like laid under these, the pave walks and roads. And this stuff is actually imported from India. Are you telling us Pakistan can't even produce this? Of course it can. Like, of course it can. A country with like DHAs up the wazoo from north to south is definitely making materials for paved walkways and roads. Like, and it's probably doing it at hyper efficiency given the cost of what we're seeing in DHA. So obviously there's a big disconnect between what the policymakers, like the foreign policy people, the government people, whoever is in charge of that entire, the entire portfolio is doing a really bad job at opening export opportunities for Pakistan. But even if you put that aside, let's say, you do have a good government that goes in and does it, right? Whoever that might be. Like, let's say you go back to the 50s and 60s, you have that kind of government. Well, the problem is they're not going to gain an inch in China. The Chinese will not let them in that market. That is the problem. So you always have to measure these things. And then when you measure things from a pure economic basis, and then people, and there's always that one guy is like, you guys always measure things on cost benefit. Dude, who is providing the jobs in the country? Who is helping us, import our essentials? Who is ensuring that we have enough dollars to support our currencies, that we can import things without things going out of, without inflation spiraling out of control? It's these industries. So, I mean, this is what it takes to run a country, right? The stakes are way more complicated. And, it works both ways, the equation. People accuse us of being simplistic in our views and show us a complicated, say, oh, things are more complicated. Well, we're saying the same thing about the other side as well. Like, we've been fed this narrative that, hey, China's this, Russia that, America that. And, now, hey, that what happened to that? Why isn't that being unpacked? Why are you always unpacking what we're saying? And we can, we'll gladly sit with any person involved in Pakistan's policymaking or anyone who has a big opinion on this, and we'll have a long discussion on this. We can have that discussion and we'll go into the details about this. Let's unpack CPEC, right? I would love to know, which Pakistani industries have started to boom as a result of CPEC, which Pakistani industries are exporting throughout the world as a result of CPEC, right? And I would love to know how much of a currency gain or hard currency gain we're getting out of China out of this. Is this a two-way trade, or is this some transactional arrangement that's been repackaged? So that's what we're kind of going in at. And at the end of the day, I just want to put it out there. If you again read Mansoor, and actually I'll upload also the pulse check episode with Mansoor, but he had this really interesting example in his book. And I think even General Feroz Khan's book, Eating Grass, sort of speaks to it as well, where he basically said that in the 1960s, there was this group of expatriates and from this group of Pakistani expatriates. So they were basically like science and engineering students who were studying in the US, nuclear stuff basically. And after seeing all the stuff they saw in the US and after getting a sense of what the Indians might be doing, they sort of began to promote the idea that Pakistan should have nuclear weapons. And if not nuclear weapons, then at least the capacity to develop nuclear weapons pretty easily. And that meant mastering the entire nuclear fuel cycle. So this group, and they basically fashioned themselves as the nuclear nationalists. They're all civilians, they're all expatriates, they're studying in the US. So they formed this bloc. And this bloc basically had this really good opportunity in London, I think, where they basically met Ayub Khan. And they proposed to Ayub Khan that, hey, for $150 million, so in 1960s money, that was like around $1.65 billion, we can use a commercial market the way India is using to build the entire nuclear fuel cycle. And if we build this entire nuclear fuel cycle, we will have not only the capacity to obviously develop nuclear weapons if we need it, but then we can start developing our own reactors and start electrifying our country very cheaply. So we don't have to rely on oil and gas imports and what have you. And, I don't want to dog on Ayub Khan in particular, because he might, wherever his issues might have been, but I want to dog on the general sentiment, the group thing. And what Ayub Khan said to them, and he listened to his credit, he listened patiently, he tried to absorb what they're saying. He said that basically, he said no, and his justification was that we're too poor a country to think about these things, and that if we ever needed a nuclear weapon, we'd get it from a friendly state. And this is documented. And it is this mentality, this thinking, that is driving Pakistan's governing today. That you have people who are living in the West, expatriates or what have you, trying to tell you that do this, stand up to China here, advance our policy interests, let's focus on certain types of manufacturing, let's do this, let's do that. You have people, many Pakistanis, if you speak to, you go online, even on the forum, you have people saying, hey, why don't we develop this sort of technology? Why don't we invest in this? This is not that difficult. Why don't we go into AI related things? And there's this group think that sort of devalues and defaults Pakistan to being, Pakistanis are too hungry and naked. Like we should not think about these things right now. And that is the problem. Right. And that is what's going to keep Pakistan behind. And it was the day when the Pakistani security establishment decided enough was enough, that they're going to go and advance in the nuclear program, that we got there, that we developed the industrial inputs, we developed the R&D and all that to basically produce our indigenous reactors, the Khushab series. So we were able to do it. And the question is, how can we do it again and again in other areas, right? And that's the issue here, that we're trying to advance. Like, this is the problem, right? So I just, we can leave it there on this topic. Then we can go back to the original pathway. So we kind of went on this long gas pit stop. Maybe it was like an EV charging pit stop. So it was like 25 minutes instead of like 2 minutes. So we're back in the car. Now we're on the Pakistan-Ukraine highway. So Arslan, do you want to speak to that then?
Yeah, so back to the sort of original point is how you can probably start this one off.
Yeah, sure. So I think I said this last time as well. But when you look at Ukraine, and maybe now it's a bit different given the war, but before the war, you wouldn't get a good sense of what they do if you just looked at the defense catalog.
Yeah.
Because if you looked at their catalog, you'd see like a bunch of old tank designs, a bunch of old Soviet era guns, old stuff, literally. Like even like, I think they have like these like slightly upgraded semi-active radar homing, air-to-air missiles and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like stuff like you're like, okay, China is clearly more advanced, right? Well, the issue was never to look at their defense catalog. What you had to do was, if you're like a bit more studious, you would actually look at the stuff beneath it. So that these other catalogs, which no one would pick up, and they're like these really crude 1990s Microsoft, Word looking documents. But these documents would actually lay out all the upstream industrial things that Ukraine was doing. And that's where it gets interesting. So that's the stuff where they're doing stuff in relation to gas turbines, metallurgy. So they're like, investing in these like new, modern alloys and stuff for the European space program. And you had these like Ukrainian companies competing for contracts for like the for Airbus programs, like various types. You had them obviously, developing rocket motor technologies, or like things that go into rocket motor technologies, like the casings, the solid fuel rocket composition. You had them looking at, basically miniaturizing gas turbines for like, cruise missiles and stuff. And the thing was, Ukraine was obviously not like a modern, like, electronics driven, industrial economy like, South Korea or China are, right? They were more on the old school industrial things. So that's where you're getting into things like the big chunky industrial things like, steel, maybe like older forms of composites and carbon fiber and, fiberglass, things like basically, as I mentioned, like gas turbines, or the blade technology for gas turbines, that kind of stuff. And that was the area where you wanted to really dig into if you're a Pakistan back in like, in the 2010s and early 2020s before the war. So at that time, all that stuff was just kind of there in the ground, right? It was like it was, there were companies that were working on it. They were sort of partnering with different Polish and Turkish companies here and there, but they didn't take off. When the Russia-Ukraine war started, then these guys, obviously, because they were there, they started to really take off. And I think, we'll have we actually have an interview lined up with one of the companies that sort of grew on the back of this growth. But basically, like, there's this one company called Firepoint, where they basically reverse engineered the S-300s that Ukraine already had, turned that into this surface-to-surface missile. They rebuilt it. So they kind of like started building new missiles using modern production technologies, modern materials, which again, Ukraine was developing already. Then they developed a new solid rocket motor engine. And this new engine will power a new version of this missile that will become an anti-ballistic missile. So an ABM. So, and believe it'll be like a hit to kill ABM. So, I mean, you're wondering, okay, how did this happen so quickly? Well, the thing is, the upstream inputs were already in development in Ukraine before then. The key was someone who had to go in. And again, if you go on, I swear to God, I swear, I keep saying this every episode. I mean it, guys. Go on Quwa, click on the search button, type in Ukraine, whatever. We were talking about this stuff back in 2016, 2017. We literally foretold this stuff, right? That Ukraine had the technology already to develop the stuff, that no one went in and productized it. And the cool thing about Pakistan was that if you look at NESCOM, we knew how to productize things. NESCOM could productize many things, like, the Fatah series, for example. Like, you can imagine that if, and maybe NESCOM did do it in the back end. We don't know what NESCOM does, right? I think they're led by scientists and engineers who are pretty objective minded. So it's possible they already went to Ukraine years before and sort of studied these things. But when NESCOM was developing the Fatah series missiles, they would basically be the kind of guys who would go to the Ukrainian industry, look at the upstream inputs, and see, okay, what can we do with these upstream inputs, right? How far can we stretch them, right? Let's say we bring in our knowledge of the Chinese electronics side and combine that with this stuff. What can we produce? And then in all likelihood, you end up with modern ballistic missiles and that kind of thing. And now the Ukrainians are so confident they're willing to go into like air to surface to air missiles. Obviously, they're investing in their own drone technologies, or even trying to indigenize the inputs for first person view fiber optic drones. Even they're confident they can get into fiber optics, to replace the Chinese in this area. They're
Hell,
trying
they're
to get
even
yeah,
developing a new turbofan engine for their cruise missiles.
yeah,
In fact, one of the quotes was it should give you second to none range versus second to only the Tomahawk in terms of range. So
yeah.
they're up to some crazy stuff over there.
They have R&D labs going into hypersonics and supersonics, like ramjets, scramjets. So because in the Soviet era, after the core Russian state, Ukraine was the number two, and it was a very close number two. It was like inches close number two R&D powerhouse. So when Ukraine broke out of Russia, it was this other industrial country, which unfortunately, and this is valid stuff, like due to like Pakistani style corruption and bureaucracy
Yeah.
issues, they were basically hamstrung until this massive war came, and that, I guess, allowed the government to clean up, right? Because they're
But
on a war footing.
But even then, the Russians were heavily dependent on Ukrainian industries for their own defensive systems. The Ukrainians, and we said this before as well, the Ukrainians literally were providing basically most, if not all, of Russia's gas turbines for their ships. They were providing engines for Russian aircraft. They were providing support for Russian aircraft. Hell, they were providing seekers and motor tech. Like, the Russians were still heavily dependent on the Ukrainians as well.
Yeah. And, through the mid 2010s, we had this sudden surge of like this pro-Russian, brotherly stuff happening in the Pakistani intelligentsia. Now, to be fair, and I don't mean to be fair to the intelligentsia, I didn't like the pro-Russian approach. I think it was very, again, here's one point I want to make clear. This is nothing to do with the Russian people. We're talking about the Russian government specifically, okay? So again, with China, we're talking about the Chinese government, okay? So we're talking about government to government issues here, right? Same with India. We're talking about the Indian government. So the problem was that the support that the Pakistan intelligentsia was giving to the Russian government was so unconditional, right? It's as if they completely forgot about Russia transferring technology for the BrahMos and India's hypersonic programs, India's nuclear program. Like, as if that was completely not a thing in the conversation, as if it was nothing. It wasn't even happening, right? And somehow relations with Pakistan would somehow stymie that entire course, or maybe allow Pakistan to procure comparable equipment for Russia, which never happened. It never happened, right? So that was the problem. However, I think, in fairness, I think people within NESCOM and the Pakistani defense industry establishment, they understood this better. And I think they did not fall for this as much, or maybe, they pragmatically leveraged Russia where they could, but they understood that, look, we're going to need other partners to help us out. And I think those channel links with Ukraine were still largely maintained, but unfortunately, we just didn't go hard on them. And what I mean by going hard on them, I mean, like, ideally in the late 2010s or in the mid 2010s, when we figured that, okay, supporting the RD-93 was going to be difficult, that we would essentially invest potentially with Ukraine in a new turbofan engine program. Because of all the countries I would be okay partnering with on this and trust outside, I think Ukraine is, they have the people to do it. They just don't have the funding and the direction, or not direction, sorry. They don't have the funding and the product requirement for it, right?
Yeah.
At that time. Well, we can come in and say, look, we want this engine, 90 kilonewtons. We're going to use it for our JF-17 right now. Maybe down the line, we'll use it for a UCAV. Maybe down the line, we'll use it for a next generation fighter aircraft. But the point is, we need this engine, and we'll co-fund it. You give us the technology you're comfortable sharing with us. But at least, if you're not going to give us the critical technology, at least help us learn it so we can do it in parallel on our own from scratch, right? So at least train our workforce so that we can then develop our own family of future engines. So we start with turbojets, then later with small turbofans, so that in 20, 30, 40 years, that we can then indigenously make our own, engine from end to end indigenously, right? And you'd be surprised. Countries are willing to train your people. In fact, that's what happened with the nuclear program. One of the things that Pakistan tried to do with its nuclear weapons program was that it would basically the initial plan was to contract out like these facilities, and these facilities would be under nuclear IEA safeguards. But these facilities would be built by European companies, and they would train the Pakistani workforce. And that Pakistani workforce would then, once the facilities are complete and running, the original workforce would then go back into academia and industry, and then train the next generation of Pakistani scientists, engineers, to learn how to design the same facilities indigenously, right? And if you notice the trend, like you have one group and they go back and train the other group, this is the same thing the Chinese did when Americans started investing in China. So the Americans would come and invest in like different, would manufacture different things in China. The Chinese would say, you have to train our workforce, and then our workforce, the same workforce will go off and do something else and train another group and another group and another group until then they become really good at something, and then they start indigenously making it. It was the same principle that we were trying to adopt. The reason why it stopped was not because people had a problem with us training our workforce or whatever, was because it stopped because the Americans now started to really hammer down the nuclear non-proliferation stuff at that time. So basically the issue was that, I think one IEA official basically told a Pakistani official was that, India did the crime, but you're going to suffer the consequences. So India got away with it because they built the fuel cycle in the 60s, which we didn't. And now we're going to shut the door behind you, or we're going to shut the door in front of you, right? However, despite that, now here's where another story gets in. Despite that, Pakistan still got that expertise and still figured out learning. It still learned all that stuff and still developed the fuel cycle anyways, indigenously. And that's the story that Mansoor Ahmed's book goes into. I'm promoting it heavily because he volunteered a lot of time to help with the podcast for Pulse Check. So I'm just going to keep promoting this book until enough people buy it. But the point being is that people are willing to trade that, like they're willing to go for that, because what you're offering Ukraine is this money, this support, this backing to be able to produce a very attractive product, which they'll go out and re-export in other places. They will come, and if you ask them, can you help us with capacity building in other areas? Chances are they will provide it. Right? That's what a win-win looks like. And that is what we're trying to wonder. That's what we're wondering. Why didn't Pakistan exact that in other areas with, China, for example?
Yeah, and I guess with all of this, we should probably preface this with, prioritizing Ukraine doesn't mean we're going to go ahead and antagonize Russia. And I just want to talk, well, we provided artillery to Ukraine, and that's why Russia's providing air defense to Afghanistan. I think there was a gap of about 2 to 3 years between the two incidents. If Russia wanted to antagonize Pakistan via, in exchange for the artillery, they would have done so a long time ago. And on top of that, it's a ridiculous point to make that, Russia has been arming India for 40, 50, 60 years. So does that now mean that so why it's this weird twist people like to put on things to go ahead and defend a third party. Who cares what the Russians think? Who gives a crap? We care about what Pakistan needs, what's in Pakistan's interest, not Russia's, not China's, not anybody else's. So if it was in Pakistan's interest to supply artillery to Ukraine, so be it. And we know, and it may be in Russia's interest to supply air defense to Afghanistan. We're not sitting here complaining and crying. We're not sitting here crying about it, begging them not to. But what we are saying is, if they do so, it's going to be a problem, and we should do something about that problem because it's in our interest to do so. If the Russians want to get into that tussle with us, that so be it. It's not one that they'll win. It's not one that they're going to have a particularly good time in. But the point is we need to start prioritizing Pakistan's interests. But back to what I was saying is, we're not going to go ahead and antagonize Russia out in the open. No, but when our leaders meet Russian leaders, they need to make it clear to them that we're not happy with their collaboration with India nor Afghanistan, but we understand why they're doing it. And on the same basis, we're going to collaborate with Ukraine. And if Russia takes steps in Afghanistan that directly threaten Pakistan's interests, then, we can do the same in Ukraine. And if you have a problem with any of that, then you know what steps you need to take in India or Afghanistan. And, and on top of that, there's another, like Turkey. Guys, they literally shot Russian planes out of the sky. They've been supporting Ukraine. They've been a vocal supporter of Ukraine. They've provided arms. They've been, they had a whole song made about them by the Ukrainians, but they're still buying S-400s from Russia. They've still got great relationships with Russia. Hell, the Russians offered Su-57 and partnerships to them. So it's not as black and white as you make it out to be.
In fact, look at India.
Yeah.
like India is literally a Quad member. It's literally part of the same architecture, which is supposed to be enforcing the CAATSA sanctions, right? It's going out and buying illicit Russian, oil, basically, and then potentially re-exporting that into other markets. It's openly going and openly discussing and about buying next generation Russian military equipment, which would and a consequence of that would involve India bankrolling the Russian defense industry out in the open. Like, is America cutting India off from any of the trade, from the world banking system or what have you? Now, people will come back and say, well, like, India's a big country, big part of the global economy, and this and that. And you know what? Okay, fair enough, fair enough. However, with the case of Pakistan is that you might be giving away too much that isn't necessary. Like, the Russians will understand. The Russians know they cannot supply you anything, right, of immense value. The Russians understand this. So when they see Pakistan going out and collaborating with Ukraine, they understand that A, this is being driven by Pakistan's rivalry with India. It's not personal to Russia. And B, Russia is not providing the same value to Pakistan anyways. So Pakistan has to go and get that from somewhere. And C, if they see A and B, the Russians will know that, okay, Pakistan is operating based on its national interests. And it's increasingly making the line on those national interests very red, meaning that it is drawing a red line and enforcing the red line. And when you enforce your red lines enough, people take notice and they respect it. They don't have to like it, but they will respect it. And if you do that enough times, then you're going to notice the discourses around Pakistan from other countries will start changing, right? It'll start changing for the better, because folks will say is that, hey, or folks will see that, hey, this country, Pakistan, takes this stuff seriously, right? These guys are enforcing their interests. If, for example, the Russians, try transferring man pads to Afghanistan, suddenly Pakistan goes and tries to neutralize it. That is, it creates trouble in Afghanistan. Sure, it's problematic from a stability standpoint for Russia, fair enough. But at the end of the day, what they see is that there's this country. We as Russians crossed a line. They voiced their disinterest in it. Then they came back and they took kinetic action to stop it. That means these guys are not messing around. And I would rather Pakistan have that reputation, that we don't mess around, than be the guys who get invited here, get a handshake there, get a pat in the back there, get a luncheon at the Kremlin or White House or whatever, and then what? Be literally be a joke. Like, people, the Europeans are recently just wondering, like, what's with these guys? Like, they are, do you need others to elevate you, or are you going to do it yourself? Right? And that's really the question here. And that's what we're saying is that, this whole, most of this episode sort of dove into us saying that Pakistan needs to do it for itself, right? And yes, you're going to have uncomfortable situations and uncomfortable conversations with other countries. What do you think the nuclear program was all about, right? And people, some people might bring that as an example. Well, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Wasn't that an example? Is this what you're talking about, Bilal and Arslan? Well, here's the problem. That was a different generation. If you think about it critically, all things held equal, do you think today's Pakistan is going to go out and develop nuclear weapons? And I'll give you the proof. You might say, well, India's doing it. If India's doing it, then yes. Well, here's the thing. India's on, Mansoor Ahmed brought this up because he's been following the Indian program. But India is on the verge of a nuclear breakout, meaning that they are about to reach a level of scalability and output that they're going to basically completely outpace Pakistan in the production of warheads, right? And then when you compound this with all of their vast mix of delivery vehicles and, strategic deployment assets, they'll have a global strike capability. Now, you might wonder, well, this is like far exceeds what Pakistan, what matters for Pakistan, what have you. Sure. But here's where it gets interesting. When India starts, fielding ICBMs and this kind of stuff at scale, suddenly many more countries will fall within India's reach, like Turkey, for example, right? Parts of Europe, Far East Asia, obviously all of China. That's going to potentially have downstream impacts that's going to affect us in the future in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, right? So when you're up against that scenario, you're going to need to take steps that counteract it. Are we having those conversations? Are we having a conversation of how do we help Turkey feel secure in its strategic interests in the scenario of an Indian global strike capability? How do we make the Saudis feel secure so that one day in a generation or two generations, the Indians don't come knocking on their door demanding their oil and gas, right? And if we think about these things, what can we as Pakistan get in return for providing them that level of security? That is the level of thinking you have to engage in. And if you're not going to think like that, then you're going to go back to the Nange Buke like mentality of our leaders in the 60s, where for $1.65 billion in today's money, they could have developed the entire nuclear fuel cycle. They chose not to. Instead, they said, we'll get it from China. If that's the mentality you're going to carry, then yeah, there's your results, right? Pakistan's going to be that country that everyone's going to take for a ride. But what we're offering, what we're suggesting, what we're advising on is to be this hawkish, interest-driven power. And again, I know there's one guy on the comments is like, you guys only think about national interest, as if, you know, Palestine and this. Dude, where do you think national interests emanate from? They emanate from a mix of what, you know, what benefits your people in their day-to-day and what your people care about. All that runs downstream from national interests reflect many different things. So if you care about Kashmir or whatever, well, you're going to have to care about the other stuff too, right? You're going to have to think in these terms. This is how stuff is managed at the world of international relations. It's a cold and brutal, you know, dog eat dog, shark eat shark, shark eat dog kind of world out there. And here we have Pakistan operating as like a, I don't know if you saw those like cute little, you know, Chihuahua dogs, like those pugs, and, you know, like those like really cute show dogs. Like we're operating like that kind of dog, right? Look at us, we're so cute, we're so nice. You know, we're allowed to everybody's house. We're not operating as like a, you know, as the predatory animal you have to be in this environment, and that's the problem. And that's the thing that needs to catch up. And that's why we had to go on this huge detour, because the original question was, why can't we afford more J10s? Why can't we buy 100 J10s in one go? And this is the downstream discussion that happened from that question. And if you want to know why Pakistan, you know, can't, you know, invest in both the Khan and buy J-35s and do this and do that and develop an indigenous hypersonic missile and, you know, what have you, it all comes downstream from this. So, you know, folks, like at some point, you know, obviously, you know, we'll have more standard defense topics lined up, but we just wanted to wrap this up so folks understand that, look, at the end of the day, if you're, you know, back to first principles, right? If it's about Pakistan's national interests, and we're going to have to incorporate these other aspects into the conversation. And yeah, like, and if anyone, you know, I know some folks are like, I remember back with the Saudi pact, you know, Asim and I were criticizing it, and, you know, here we are. It didn't amount to anything. You know, we kind of warned about that, and folks were basically saying that you guys, you know, with respect, quote unquote, you guys, foreign policy is not your forte. Well, go and start a website, right? Like, go and show me your foreign policy thinking, right? Let's see you write this up.
Comments.
Sorry?
All tell us in the comments. I mean, there's some, you know, we do get some interesting comments. I believe one guy was saying we look at things too much from a defense point of view, and it's quite interesting because the podcast is literally called Defence Uncut. What else would we be looking at it from?
Yeah. But I mean, you know what, like when we have to, we'll we'll sort of branch into other areas. However, just so folks know, what we have lined up for next week is we're going to talk about Woot-Tech. Hopefully we'll get Bilal Siddiqui from Woot-Tech on pulse check as well. But recently they tested their rocket-assisted takeoff mortar. I think it's primarily designed for their one-way attack drones and loitering munitions. However, it's a big step in many ways, and the big one I think is not so much the specific system, because it's pretty, again, it's like what, 2,500 newtons impulse power, so obviously not meant for big applications. But the fact is, you have a private company firing rockets in Pakistan now.
Yeah, it just opens up the doors, doesn't it, to
yeah. But it's an interesting point is that, again, it goes back to this earlier MODP meeting. And I think the drone, we've talked about Ukraine. It just seems like they have like a Ukrainian advisor in Pakistan sometimes. So it's like the same steps that Ukraine took to kind of open up their drone industry, Pakistan is literally taking the same steps as well. So I found that to be interesting. So we're going to have that discussion next week with Asim, hopefully, and Arslan. And then, yeah, that's it for this episode, everyone. Thanks for listening if you got this far. If not, I'd love to know where you stopped listening, because that'll be fun. I think it'd be a fun track. But in any case, I thank everyone for listening and tuning in. Take care and bye.
Goodbye.